By my count, there have been 40 movies or so about Wyatt Earp and the gunfight at the OK Corral. But I cannot recall a single one that comes at it from the cowboy point of view. Also, none of these movies has dealt with just how close I believe Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp came to being lynched. All right. Now, I trust that most of you know the Wyatt Earp version of events at the OK Corral fight. So let's go to the cowboy version just to get kind of give you a mindset of what was happening in Cochise County at that time. And that's not to say that this version is correct, but this is how I believe the cattlemen and the cowboys of Cochise County view the fight to this day. Let me say this, that if you go to Tombstone, it's Wyatt Earp 24/7. But if you go outside of Tombstone to the ranching communities, Elfrida, Rodeo, New Mexico, into the Boot Heel of New Mexico, the Earps are looked upon as kind of carpetbaggers, and the cowboys feel like the cowboys in this story got a bad deal. Okay, with that said, here's how the cowboys see the OK Corral fight. 5 shots were fired by the Earp party before any of the cowboys attempted to fight back. Only 2, Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury, even had a weapon, and their weapon was in their holster. And as the Marshal Virgil Earp ordered them to raise their hands, the Clanton and the McLaurys complied, only to be shot down like dogs. Now, after the fight, immediately after the events, 30 shots were fired. The sheriff of the county, John Bean, came up to Wyatt Earp and said, I need to see you. He wanted to arrest Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp said, I won't be arrested now. You threw us, Johnny. You told us they were unarmed. Now, this is true because Behan was talking to the cowboys, trying to get them to leave town. He saw the Earps and Holliday coming down Fremont Street, and he ran up the boardwalk and took Wyatt Earp by the arm and said, don't go down there. I've disarmed them. So Wyatt Earp, believing him, put his pistol in his pocket. He'd been carrying it, ready for an altercation, and they kept going. Now, this is a contention point because in the subsequent hearing, it hinges on, were the Earps going down there for a personal vendetta, or were they lawmen enforcing the law? Well, if Earp had heard from Behan that they were disarmed, was there a reason to go on? And the fact that they did go on speaks to they wanted to stop the threats, and they wanted to face them. And then, of course, everything unraveled from there. Here's another little point of contention that's important for us to know today. That is that after the fight happened, the Vizina mine whistle went off. And that was a signal to the Tombstone Vigilante Group. This is a group of local citizens, kind of a volunteer fire department organization. They showed up on Fremont Street, 70 strong, 2 by 2 down the middle of the street. Now, they were friends with Wyatt Earp and his brothers, because that's were the law people, and they were town people. And so they took the wounded Earps. Morgan and Virgil were both wounded in the fight, and they took them to a drugstore of all places, and they dressed their wounds. And then they found a buggy or a hand cart. It's unclear a little bit on the testimony. And they carried them to their house down Fremont Street and First. Now, Ike Clanton paid for a fancy funeral, and he had a sign placed in the window of the funeral home that said "Murdered on the Streets of Tombstone." And so all the people from the surrounding area were showing up to support the cowboys, and there was a huge funeral there. On October 29th, 1881, an arrest warrant was issued before Justice of the Peace J.B. Smith. And this is what it said, quote, that Wyatt Earp did willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, feloniously, and with malice aforethought kill or murder William Clanton, Thomas McLaury, and Frank McLaury. Meanwhile, Ike Clanton filed murder charges against the Earps and Holliday with Justice Wells Spicer. On October 31st, 1881, Spicer began hearings to determine if the Earps and Holliday were to be bound over for a murder trial. And that's when the first witnesses came on, and they basically really gave it to the Earps. And they were telling the story that I told you a little earlier about their version of the fight. Well, then another important coin dropped, and that was that on November 4th, Will R. McLaury arrived in Tombstone from Fort Worth, Texas, and he was a brother of the two slain McLaurys. And he immediately got on the prosecution team, and he got them remanded to jail without bail. Now, Virgil and Morgan were exempted because of their wounds. And so on November 7th, 1881, Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp were arrested by Harry Woods, and they were held in the makeshift jail, okay, on 6th Street. Now, this is important because the town was so new, they didn't have a jail, okay? So they had this makeshift jail, and when you look it up, it's just really hard to believe, because Fred Dodge described it as a 10-foot by 12-foot wooden structure with 2x4 stacked on each other and pounded down, and it looked more like a chicken coop than an actual jail. And the idea that Doc Holliday, who wasn't the healthiest person on the planet, and Wyatt Earp were held in this small cubicle for almost 16 days. Now, there's a couple of incidents where they were let go, and then Will McLaury, through his legal shenanigans and stuff, got them put back in. But they were in there for about 16 days. And it is true that their friends, the Earp's friends, guarded that 24/7 for the entire time. But I wondered how close they came to being lynched, because there's a famous case not too long after this one that bears heavily on what could have happened, okay? And that is a mere 26 months later, down in Bisbee, Arizona, December 8th, 1881, 1883, I'm sorry. 5 Clifton area cowboys rode into Bisbee, and they tried to rob the Castaneda Goldwater store. There was supposedly a payroll that came in for $7,000. It had been held up from a stagecoach thing. Anyway, the robbery went awry, and 2 of the guys, the cowboys outside, got in a gunfight with locals, and 5 people were killed, including a woman who was pregnant. And so after a long chase across 2 states and into Chihuahua, Mexico, they captured the 5 cowboys, and they dropped dime on a guy named Jim Heath. And they claimed that he was a saloon owner in Bisbee, and they claimed that he was the one who masterminded the actual robbery. And so the 5 cowboys were tried at the county seat, which was Tombstone at the time. And they have a brand new courthouse now with a sturdy jail, by the way. And the 5 cowboys are tried and convicted and sentenced to hang in March of that year. And John Heath, he's has a separate trial, and his attorneys get him a 2nd-degree murder charge, and he is going to prison. And then they file a motion for a retrial, and the citizens of Cochise County have had enough, and the vigilante committee from Bisbee goes up to Tombstone. They were believed to be between 50 and 150 men, and they storm the jail, the secure jail now, and they pull out John Heath. They leave the 5 cowboys because they're sentenced to be hanged, and they are going to hang them from the balustrade of the new courthouse. But the sheriff at the time, Jerome Ward, talks them into not besmirching the courthouse that's brand new. And so they take the prisoner down to the corner of First and Tough Nut, and they throw a rope over the top of the telegraph pole there, and they hang him. Now, what's ironic is it's within spitting distance of where the makeshift jail was, where Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp were held a mere 2 years before. And just to give you an idea how dangerous it was when Doc and Wyatt were in that makeshift jail, between the years 1860s to 1911, there were 42 legal hangings in Arizona and 32 lynchings. So it was certainly talked about by the cowboys. They were upset enough. And as a fact, as we know, they ended up with 2 assassination attempts on the Earps, one of them successful. and the Earps and Doc Holliday left Arizona in the spring of 1882 as fugitives from justice. So how do we get from this lurid telling of a familiar tale to the glorious finale of the triumph of law and order at the OK Corral? Well, that took a couple of very good writers. In fact, they're heroes of mine. That would be Walter Noble Burns and Stuart Lake, who came out with some pretty amazing storytelling books in the 20s and 30s. And that launched the 40 movies that tell this fantastic tale about a lawman who was flawless and who was brave, courageous, and bold. And so now you know just how close Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp came to being jerked to Jesus, as they used to say in the Old West. Is there anything to be learned from this? I think it's this. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there.